Academic terms for Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave If the 4th of July. I want you to record your own definitions of these terms. I'm going to talk through 12 terms, and I want you to write down what these terms mean in your own words. So in other words, don't copy the text. I'm going to give you an example of one for the first one here that I'm going to translate, but you're basically paraphrasing what I'm saying. I want you to write this down in ways that make sense to you. I'd also like you to write down an example of something that you think of where this has happened in real life, or maybe a movie, a book, anywhere where you see a real example of this, where you can think of this. Okay. Your example can also come from the text of Frederick Douglass, which we're going to read in the future, but it would be better if you wrote something else because you're more likely to remember it. You will be quizzed on some of these terms. They will show up on your quiz when we quiz for Frederick Douglass' speech at the end of the week. They will also be important when we answer questions, and more importantly, that you understand the techniques that he's using as a speaker and that you can use them yourself. At the end of this, what you will do is you're going to use some of these terms. Actually, you're going to use one technique and practice one that you might be able to use in your own speech. So I want you to be thinking about that and writing a couple sentences of your own that might help get your point across for your own speech that you've been writing, or your own argument that you've been writing before we did this. Okay, so let's go through these really quickly, all right? So the first one, first of all, we're talking about ethos, pathos, and logos. You may remember the ethos has to do with the credibility of the speaker. Pathos has to do with emotion and appealing to an audience's emotion, and logos has to appeal to the audience's mind. There's more to it than just that, but those are some real basics. Let's start off with ethos and talk about two types of ethos that exist. One is extrinsic ethos. That means that's referring to the already existing opinion an audience may have about a speaker. So, for example, at the time of his speech, Douglass was well respected by his audience of fellow abolitionists. And we might also think of other speakers. For example, if someone famous walks up to a podium, and we already know, for example, Denzel Washington, we're going to listen to him and what he has to say. If Steve Jobs is giving a speech before any group, really, when he was alive, for example, he gave a speech to Stanford. The graduates listed on the edges of their seats because here was one of the major technological innovators of the 21st century speaking to them. It didn't have anything to do with the speech. It was just because he was Steve Jobs. So in other words, this is how I wrote this. Extrinsic ethos is the credibility an author has before the speech is ever given. And I wrote down an example right down here. Tom Brady speaking about football, for example. So you can copy that one, but what I want you to do is to translate this into your own words and give an example. All right, so that's practice. That's extrinsic ethos. Here's intrinsic ethos. Intrinsic ethos is referring to an audience, what the audience learns about the speaker's character through the speech. So, in other words, the author or the speaker may already have some sort of ethos before they walk up to the podium, but in this case, it's the actual speech. The speech is what carries the credibility. In other words, you believe what you hear. What they're saying is persuasive. And so you're going to believe that person. It could also be a number of other things as well. It could be the way that the speaker addresses the audience, is very respectful. All types of other things, eye contact, all those things are intrinsic. They're actually in the delivery of the speech itself. So we have extrinsic ethos and intrinsic ethos. So we're going to look for that, and we're mostly going to see some intrinsic ethos, but it's important to have some background about Frederick Douglass to know that he's got intrinsic ethos, extrinsic ethos as well. The next thing that you need to understand is the idea of figurative language when we talk about, go back over here, figurative language when we talk about pathos. So this is to provoke an emotional response when we talk about pathos. So figurative language means that I'm going to use things that are non-literal. So for example, metaphors. Metaphors are things that it helps people imagine something. So I can compare two unlike things without using like or as. And in my speech, I will do this to try to to help the audience visualize. And it's very emotional thing. I can also use outside allusions if I know the audience has a certain book that they know, or a movie, or maybe a character, something like that that the whole audience connects to. I'm going to use that in my speech because the audience can connect to that, and it creates emotion. Because when I reference a movie or something like that, or a football team or anything like that, what it happens is the audience has an automatic emotional connection. Okay, and allusions can be a number of different things. We're going to come back to those and be more specific about what those are later. But allusions and metaphors in this speech. You can also have other parts of figurative language too, like idioms and metaphor. Idioms and similes, hyperbole, all kinds of stuff. But these are the two main ones that we're going to see in this speech. Another thing that you want to look at is word choice when we talk about pathos. So word choices can trigger emotions. For example, Douglas is going to use connotative words such as grievous, scandalous, and shocking. When we talk about connotation, it's the word associations we get with words like grievous or scandalous or shocking. When I think of a scandal, I think of something terrible that a politician may have done these days, a scandal. And so when you use these words, there's all these different associations we have with them. For example, if I use the word terrorist in a speech, that can be used in a way that creates a lot of emotion for an audience. So that's how word choice can really trigger emotions. Listen for these in all sorts of speeches, but especially in this speech this week as we listen to Frederick Douglass. Another part of speech that we want to record when we talk about it is logos. There's two types of reasoning that go to logos. Remember, logos is to engage the mind. So is to support a claim with reasons and evidence, such as facts, examples, and statistics, which we've been talking about quite extensively. With Douglas's speech, he's going to follow two lines of reasoning. So with deductive reasoning, what happens is instead of leading from specific evidence to a general principle or generalization, he begins with general principles and then applies those principles to specific facts about slavery. In other words, when we've talked about argument, when he uses deductive reasoning, he's using what we've talked about in class, where you start with a claim, then you go to evidence, and then you go so on and so forth. Inductive reasoning is the opposite. So with inductive reasoning, you're actually going to go from backwards. You're going to start off with an actual generalization, and then you're going to go from there. If this doesn't make sense yet, just write down what you think makes sense from this text, and as we see it happen in the actual speech itself, it'll make a lot more sense. So I would encourage you to read that again, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in class, because you really need to see some examples. Okay, those are a couple of things. Let's talk a little bit about rhetorical devices. So rhetorical devices are simply this. Rhetorical devices come from the idea of rhetoric, and rhetoric is talking about persuasion. So think about this. Rhetorical devices means persuasive devices, usually in speech. All right. The first one is an allusion. We talked about this before. This is an indirect reference to a famous person, place, event, or literary work. And in this example right here, Douglas actually talks about the city of Babylon, which comes from the Bible. And lots of his readers, his listeners, would have known this story. And so he refers to an outside piece of literature, a literary work. But he could have also used an event or a place or a famous person. Imagine, for example, if someone were to talk about 9/11 and talked about that in the speech or referred to that. That would be something that our audience today would understand. Antithesis is actually a way that the speech is going to appear, or the way that the sentences are put together, the syntax. And this is presenting contrasting ideas and parallel structures. You're going to see these a lot in speeches. This is where you have one sentence usually, and there's two halves up here. It's parallel. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Notice how rejoice and mourn are opposites. Notice how both sides have three words. And notice that you have two pronouns on either side. This is the parallel structure, but oftentimes they will mean the opposite. Look for these in